Why more Americans are asking, is Trump trying to break Iran or control the Strait of Hormuz? Tonight, one question is getting louder in Washington, louder on Wall Street, and louder at gas stations across America. Is this really about security, or is this about control? Because when you strip away the slogans, strip away the war language, strip away the chest-thumping politics, what are we actually looking at? A US blockade, a collapsing peace process, a global oil choke point under military pressure, and an American president who has openly talked about taking Iran's oil and even floated the idea of seizing Karg Island, one of Iran's most critical export hubs. So tonight, we need to ask the question many Americans are already asking. Why is Donald Trump pushing so hard against Iran? And just as importantly, why are so many Americans no longer buying the official story? Because here is the reality as of April 23, 2026. Talks connected to Pakistan have stalled, the ceasefire is shaky, Iran has tightened its grip over the Strait of Hormuz, the United States is still blockading Iranian shipping, and the result is exactly what critics warned about from the start. More instability, more danger, more economic pain, and no clear off-ramp. And let's be very clear at the start. You do not have to support every move made by Tehran to recognize one basic principle. Iran is still a sovereign country. It is not American territory. It is not a US energy reserve. And it is not Washington's legal or moral right to decide that pressure, strangulation, or forced submission is the same thing as peace. That argument is not pro-Iranian regime. That argument is called international reality. Now, before anyone jumps in, yes, Iran's actions in and around Hormuz have raised serious alarm. Reuters and AP report that Iran seized or fired on commercial vessels after the peace process faltered, and Iran has used the impasse to tighten its maritime control. That is dangerous. That is destabilizing, and it deserves scrutiny. But here is where this gets politically explosive. A lot of Americans are looking at this crisis and saying, hold on, why are we acting like only one side is escalating? Because the United States is not standing back as some neutral referee. The US is actively enforcing a blockade on Iranian ports and shipping, and Reuters reports that unauthorized vessels entering or leaving the blockaded area face interception, diversion, or capture. That is not symbolic pressure. That is military coercion. And once you understand that, the viewer's next question becomes obvious. Is Trump trying to force a deal or trying to force surrender? That is the heart of this story. Trump's public rhetoric has shifted over time. Reuters documented that his stated goals have ranged from weakening Iran's military and nuclear capabilities to broader ambitions tied to regime pressure and strategic dominance. He has also publicly boasted that with more time, the US could open the Hormuz Strait, take the oil, and make a fortune. And in an interview with the Financial Times, he openly discussed the possibility of taking Iran's oil by seizing Karg Island. That matters, because once an American president starts talking like that, millions of people in Iran, across the Middle East, and here at home stop hearing the language of security and start hearing the language of empire. And frankly, can you blame them? If any foreign power said it might seize a strategic American energy hub for peace, Americans would call that what it is, aggression. So why should Iran hear it any differently? Now let's talk about what many ordinary Americans appear to think. The polling is brutal for the White House. An AP NORC poll found that about 6 in 10 Americans say recent US military action against Iran has gone too far. A Reuters Ipsos poll found Americans have a bleak view of the war, with strong concern about the danger to US troops, rising energy prices, and the conflict's effect on ordinary Iranians. Another Ipsos poll found 58% disapproved of US military strikes against Iran, while only 38% approved, and more than 3/4 opposed sending US ground troops. That tells you something important. Americans may not trust Iran. In fact, many still see Iran as an enemy, but that does not mean they trust Trump's judgment on war. AP reported in February that only about 3 in 10 Americans had high confidence in Trump's judgment on adversaries and military force abroad. So the public mood is not, go further. The public mood is closer to, what exactly are we doing and who is paying for it? And the answer to that second question is painful. Everyone is paying for it. Reuters reports the war has already wiped out more than $50 billion worth of crude oil production, with Gulf Arab producers losing around 40% of crude output in March, and the market fallout could last for months or years.
Reuters also reported that Brent crude climbed above $103 a barrel as the latest round of tensions and shipping disruptions deepened. So if you are an American family looking at fuel costs, inflation, shipping costs, grocery bills, or airline prices, this is no longer some abstract foreign policy argument. This is personal.
And that's where the political suspicion around Trump grows. Because critics increasingly believe this is not just about stopping escalation. It is about demonstrating dominance at the world's most important oil choke point, while showing domestic voters that Trump is still the strongman in the room. Reuters has noted that the conflict has exposed Trump's economic pressure point, Hormuz. Analysts cited by Reuters say Iran's ability to disrupt the strait has raised domestic political pressure on Trump and exposed U.S. vulnerability to energy shocks. With midterms looming, that pressure is not theoretical. So from a skeptical American point of view, the picture looks like this. Trump cannot afford to look weak. He wants a win. He wants leverage. He wants Iran boxed in. And control over Hormuz, or at least control over the terms of passage, pressure, and oil flow, becomes the center of gravity.
That does not automatically mean he wants a full occupation of Iran, but it does mean his strategy looks a lot less like diplomacy and a lot more like coercive dominance. And for Iran, that is exactly the problem. Because from Tehran's perspective, the argument is simple. You cannot call for negotiations while blockading our economy. You cannot say, come to the table, while holding a naval choke on our lifeline. And you cannot talk about peace while publicly floating the seizure of our oil infrastructure. Reuters reported this week that Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said U.S. breaches of commitments and the blockade of Iranian ports are the main obstacles to genuine negotiation. That is not some fringe statement. That is the Iranian government's central argument right now. Now, let me say something important here, because this is where serious journalism matters. Supporting Iran's right to live, trade, and exist as a sovereign state is not the same as defending every tactical move made by Iranian hardliners. Those are two different conversations. You can condemn attacks on civilian shipping. You can reject brinkmanship in the Strait of Hormuz. You can criticize Iran's military posture, and still say the following sentence without hesitation. No country has the right to economically suffocate another country into obedience, and then pretend that obedience equals peace. That is the moral line in this story. And it's also why this issue is becoming more controversial inside the United States. Because once the language moves from deterrence to take the oil, people start hearing echoes of old wars, old lies, and old disasters. And millions of Americans remember exactly how that usually ends. Another mission without a clear endpoint. Another promise of quick results. Another claim that pressure will force compliance. Another region pushed closer to chaos.
Why does Trump seem so determined to push against Iran and the Strait of Hormuz? Because Hormuz is leverage. Because oil is leverage. Because economic pain is leverage. Because Trump appears to believe pressure can produce the deal, or the submission he wants. But here is the part his supporters do not want to hear. The more this strategy looks like strangulation instead of diplomacy, the easier it becomes for Iran to argue that it is not defending a regime, it is defending national survival. And once that frame takes hold, Washington loses the moral high ground fast. That is why this story matters so much. Because the question is no longer just whether Iran will bend. The question is whether America is once again drifting into a posture where force, blockade, and economic punishment are being sold as a substitute for a real political solution. And a growing number of Americans appear unconvinced. They see the prices, they see the instability, they hear the rhetoric. And they are asking a very simple question. If peace is really the goal, why does this keep sounding like conquest? That is the debate now. That is the controversy now. And that is why the world is watching the Strait of Hormuz tonight. Because what happens there next will not just decide shipping lanes. It may decide whether this crisis moves back toward diplomacy or slides into something much darker. This is Topline America. If you want fact-based geopolitical analysis without the sugarcoating, subscribe, like, and stay with us. Because this story is moving fast and we'll keep tracking every turn.